Welcome everyone to our last session of Living with Water. And it's was really exciting to have had an amazing few weeks, but also quite sad to have gotten to the end. We'll also have a conclusion session toward the end of the session, so it's a bit longer. But we have got some really exciting talks going ahead. And I'll start right away by presenting our first speaker, and I'll present each of the speakers before they go, and we'll keep questions to the end as we've been doing. So make sure to take notes or also use the chat if you want to in the meantime. But I'll go straight into introducing people because I'm quite excited to get to listen to them and then open a conversation. So Margaryta Golovchenko is a PhD candidate in the art history department at the University of Oregon. Her research, which is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, examines women-animal relationships in French and British art and visual cultures of the 18th and 19th centuries. Her scholarship has appeared in publications such as Journal of Comparative Literature and Aesthetics, Fantastica Journal, Symbolism, and International Annual of Critical Aesthetics, Journal of Posthumanism, and Capacious, with book chapters forthcoming in the edited volumes Environmental and Cultural Destruction at Imperial Margins with de Gruyter, Going Feral, a proposition for speculative animism in the arts, Vernon Press, and Fairies, a companion with Peter Lang. She's also an art and literary critic. So if you'll join me with applause reaction to welcome Margaryta, I'll let her take over.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. So I want to start us off with the following painting by the artist Christophe Huet. At first glance, the painting looks like a hallmark 18th century landscape depicting an idyllic, if nondescript, setting with a variety of animals. The work's classification in the database of French museums draws attention to only one of these animals, raising its importance in the composition. However, the work has a more curious dimension that may be hidden at first glance, revealed only when one looks closer at the composition. As well as a crane and a macaw, there is another animal that is quite uncommon to see in artwork from this period, which is a Canadian goose. It's in the bottom, very much prominently in the center, and it's shown to be calmly grazing, which is being from Canada myself, quite rare to see them be so calm. The fact that these animals are depicted in close proximity to each other raises questions about how they were brought together, conveying a sense of the exotic and also of human wealth, as it would not have been easy to acquire specimens from the colonies at this time. Today, the work remains in situ at the Château du Chantilly, known as the Musée Condé. And here is just an example of, for a sense of scale and how they would be hanging in a space. So the chateau is a place of fantasy, and the painting is one of several such panels that Huet produced, which make the exotic element all the more explicit, as in the following two landscape paintings I'm showing here. So note the inclusion of the pagoda on the left and a vaguely Eastern-looking gazebo in the work on the right. The architecture reinforces the exotic animals that Huet depicts. His approach is reminiscent of a common tactic that was used in the 18th century, where continents were personified and accommodated by decorative features that helped identify them. A lot of the times, these features were animals, as seen in this prominent example by Giovanni Domenico Tiepolo in his approach to the subject. Huet's works bring to mind the matter of transportation, of the migration of animals, although they do not appear interested in unraveling this topic further. In fact, these panels exist in the same space as highly exoticized depictions of white figures that are made to look Asian, dressed in clothing that is vaguely associated with China, and their features exaggerated and made to perform a sort of yellow face. Nonetheless, I begin with Huet's painting to emphasize how the matter of animal presence, or how the presence of water, rather, is hidden in plain sight, sometimes assumed but not actually interrogated. So this topic of animal migration or animal transportation, as it is a process instigated by humans rather than initiated by animals themselves, has been the subject of increased scholarship in the past decade. So a prominent example I want to mention here is this volume called Maritime Animals. In the introduction, Kaori Nagai introduces the term navifauna to refer to animals that were on board the HMS Challenger on its expedition from 1872 to 76, a category that includes animals brought along on the journey, such as dogs and livestock, but also animals that were acquired along the way, primarily exotic animals, and those animals that simply tagged along, so to speak, for the journey, such as insects and those we commonly consider as pests, such as rats. Nagai also makes an important distinction between maritime animals and marine or oceanic animals, between those that form a relationship with the sea through travel and those that call the sea their home. Maritime Animals goes on to discuss these different narratives and write animal histories on a species level. Nagai's provocative definition of maritime animals takes a focus on animals as travelers, willing or not. This very brief presentation, which is also the starting point of what I hope will be one of my next projects. So it's very much kind of a thought experiment in some ways, or the beginnings of some of this thinking. But in this brief time today, I want to take Nagai's definition and carry it forward and into the posthumanist realm by asking, what does it mean to think of animal-water kinship? So scholars like Macarena Gomez Barres have written about the ways in which indigenous groups, particularly in South America, have continued to advocate for water's agency and to have the identities of bodies of water recognized through legislature. This is one means of thinking about kinship, which aligns water and animals along the axis of activism. Such an approach is similarly not without merit, as scholars like Nicole Shukin have written about the way animal bodies as non-human beings have been employed in the service of capitalist desire, or as Shukin terms it, animal capital, by which she refers to, quote, the paradox of an anthropocentric order of capitalism whose means and effects can be all too post-human. That is, one that ideologically grants and materially invests in a world in which species boundaries can be radically crossed as well as reinscribed in the genetic and aesthetic pursuit of new markets. Instead, I want to think closer to the work of Steve Mentz and Ostrina Neimanis, who emphasize water's uncontrollable aspect. Mentz does this by putting forth the idea of what he calls seep ecology, which he defines as, quote, a continual overflow that abrades and distorts familiar ecological habits of thought. Ostrina Neimanis writes of watery embodiment by drawing attention to the fact that, quote, we are all bodies of water, which forms a shared kinship through inescapable aqueousness of our bodies, and reminds us, as she writes, that, quote, discrete individualism is a rather dry, if convenient, myth. This means that an alignment between animals and water is similarly less literal, although precedence for the literal remains, as evidenced by maritime animals. When I first proposed this paper, I was still very much thinking about the animal as cargo narrative, which segments the animal from water and returns water to the kind of neutral space that scholars like Trisha Cusack object to, arguing that the sea is rather a social space rather than a neutral space. And in the social space, it has the potential for unexpected encounters to form. However, in the time since I initially submitted the abstract to give this talk, my review of the archival materials that I uncovered during my trip in summer 2024, as well as in sitting in the mess produced by the various human-animal entanglements that I trace in my dissertation, have revealed a different path that has slowly emerged, a path that is more speculative, but hopefully provocative and generative, with a perspective on animal-water kinship. I therefore want to take this time to work through a few of these archival examples and outline the beginnings of this queer non-human kinship. In doing so, I take note of Jeremy Chow when he writes of the way, quote, water's queerness enables us to read with and against canonicity, to visualize how environmental interactors undermine linked conceptions of canon, coloniality, and masculine bodies believed inviolable. For this reason, the animal-water alignment that comes out of these examples is about a shared force of disruption, where water is often a visually unseen, yet economically and politically felt agent who complicates, if not outright interrupts, the physical movement of animals that would other benefit an imperial and later capitalist system that was fundamentally anthropocentric. So let us return to France once more. As I was going about researching for my dissertation on women and animals, I kept looking for any information about the exotic animal trade, hoping to find logs or even statistics that would speak to the frequency of exotic animal ownership and the means by which private individuals could acquire them. To my surprise, my findings were very scant. The Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer in France, which contains records pertaining to the French colonies, do not house designated files on animals that were brought to France, despite the fact that paintings like Huet's are a direct testament of this. An archivist directed me to a number of files that listed exports from the colonies, informing me that my best shot was by going through all of these files and reading the inventories in the hopes of finding any mention of an animal. A task that I'm still undergoing because, as I quickly realized, 18th and 19th century handwriting is quite a difficult thing to make out and is a separate kind of endeavor in addition to writing a dissertation. In my persistent search, I happened upon a curious thick file at the National Archives of France, which contained within it a file on the transportation of animals from Africa to France from the end of the 18th century to the end of the 19th century, roughly. Within were numerous letters and other documents meticulously documenting the concerns of the government to transport the animals safely back to France and the efforts that were necessary to transport the animals. A diagram of a giraffe gifted to the King of France, Charles X, from the King of Egypt reinforces the commercial nature of these animals, as it was studied by none other than the French naturalist Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, who obtained exact measurements that could later be used by the Museum of Natural History in Paris, where he was a core professor. The main difficulty with looking after this giraffe appeared to be due to the animal's vast consumption of milk, which was about 20 to 25 liters a day, as documented in one letter that was sent.
Lost your sound? Your microphone kind of gave a...
Oh, I could hear Margaryta well. Sam?
Apologies, I think it's a mute problem.
Is it
No, I
is it
can hear
working?
you. I think it might be on Sam's side because I can hear you well, Margaryta. Can everybody else hear Margaryta well? Anybody can? Yeah, I see Tasha saying thumbs up. So I think it's only it might be an issue with Sam. Please continue, Margaryta.
Oh no. Um, So the main difficulty with looking after the giraffe appeared to be due to the animal's vast consumption of milk, about 20 to 25 liters a day, as documented in one letter to the Minister of the Interior. And I want to mention here as well, for anyone who is interested, there's also a similar kind of account with a focus on lions that was published recently in a monograph by Katie Hornstein, where she similarly talks about lions and this kind of tension between transporting animals as living animals, but also as pelts or as in some case, there were a few cases of taxidermy lions as well, if I remember correctly, which is a fascinating, more in-depth study on, again, a species level. So the condition of animals became especially significant when the animals in question were consumed. Thus, the 19th century saw a growing debate in Britain about how to transport animals in ways that minimized their suffering. The concern, which was articulated against the backdrop of a growing animal liberation movement, stops short of making the change that would truly end animal suffering by removing the need for animal death in the first place. Instead, a report produced in 1870 on the transit of animals by sea and land articulates the primary concern as the need, quote, to protect animals from unnecessary suffering from overcrowding and other causes during their sea passage from ports abroad to ports in Great Britain, from ports in the United Kingdom to the ports in Great Britain, also on their landing and also during their inland transit, with the intention to, quote, bring animal food to market in the most fit state for human consumption. And this is directly referencing the kind of argument and language that Nicole Shukin is using, as I mentioned earlier, with animal capitalism. So this section of the report that dealt with the transport of animals by sea included subsections dedicated to the fittings aboard cattle vessels, the treatment of animals on board, and accommodation at places of shipment and unshipment. One of the options explored in the report, which also generates some debate, is the matter of transporting dead meat and whether such an approach would be harmful to the end human consumer. When animals are reduced to goods, as in the case of the giraffe sent to France or the livestock on its way to market in Britain, water is an obstacle, a means to be overcome because it threatens the animal body and therefore the human body, whether literally or the human body as a kind of polis, as a collective. Water plays an equally important role in the life of Queen Victoria, who similarly received many animals as gifts from foreign dignitaries and loyal subjects from colonies, such as Australia. And I found quite a rich file actually on this, and among the animals she received, like I said, are from Australia, there were kangaroos, wombats, several lions, there was an elephant as well. And some of these animals would die along the way, as in the case of a couple of gazelles that were part of a large shipment that she received from the King of Morocco in 1850. Although the rate of survival, if it can be called that, was quite substantial by this point compared to the documents from the 18th century in the shipment of animals, for example, to France. So I want to draw attention to one particular letter that was sent to Queen Victoria's uncle, King Leopold of Belgium in 1844, which concerned one of her beloved dogs, who you see pictured here in a portrait. It was a Skye Terrier named Islay. King Leopold wrote of returning the dog to the Queen, a fact that is puzzling considering the date on the letter follows Islay's death. But also raises the question of why the Queen's companion would find himself so far from home, even if he were alive. What is touching about the letter is a sentence in which the king mentions the puppies he received from the Queen, and how they become seasick on their journey. His final remark that they were quite restored on shore, speaking to a level of care that is afforded to those animals who have crossed into the territory of companion animals. This letter extract, which is unique in the accounts the Queen gives of both her own animal companions and the letters she exchanges with relatives, gives a personal tone to what remains consistently a perception of water as a problem to be solved, except in this case, a motivator is care for animals rather than a more profit-based desire. So in these archival instances drawn from the National Archives of France and Britain and the Royal Archives in Windsor, water becomes an entity to be reckoned with, a presence to be acknowledged and even accounted for. Water demands space in these narratives, even as it retains its fluidity. Invisibility becomes a matter of being overlooked rather than being literally absent, as water becomes capable of bringing together animals in Yue's painting, even if the painting has no actual water in sight. Where the history of water as a resource and as a home for various life forms involves thinking and conceptualizing and thus confining water to something resembling a compact space, to locate water in histories of animal transportation is to acknowledge its agentialness and the internal hydrocycles as discussed as such by Strina Mimoň. Thus, while there's a history of animals as colonial subjects that is still being written and one that, as I said, I initially attempted to write with quite a lot of difficulties, but a truly post-human approach asks in what ways water can be found in the pockets of disruption it leaves behind in the archival record, no differently from the way physical water chips away at the material world. And I will stop there for the sake of time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Margaryta. This was really fascinating. We'll now move on to our next speaker, Tasha Pick. So I'll let you share your screen as I read out your bio to introduce you. So Tasha Pick is a PhD scholar entering their final year at the University of Manchester. Their project examines the Oceanic, quote unquote, in contemporary experimental film, tracing the ocean's implication in ongoing histories of racial violence and border policing. Theoretically, their work lies at the intersection of film theory, psychoanalysis, queer theory, and Afro-pessimism. They have presented work on Isaac Julian's film installation at the Tales of the Diasporic Ordinary Conference at Humboldt University, Berlin, on whiteness and negativity and My Octopus Teacher of Queer Intersections at the University of Oxford. and on representation of border policing in forensic architecture's shipwreck at the threshold of Europe at the MECCSA conference, among others. They are a member of the Imprint Embodied Documentary Collective and recently participated in the Bodies of Water filmmaking workshop. They teach in English and American Studies and co-organize the Sexuality Summer School at the University of Manchester. If you'll join me with your reaction to welcome Tasha, we're really excited to hear them present.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Giulia and Sam for organising this seminar series. It's really lovely to be involved. So this presentation is really a work in progress, so I welcome any thoughts and feedback that you might have at the end. Yeah, as Giulia said, my project is using psychoanalytic theory to think through kind of cultural fantasies about the ocean. So in this paper, I'm thinking with the work of the French psychoanalyst Giulia Kristeva to try and kind of draw out some of the latent content in the fantasy of dissolution, and then also to try and situate this fantasy as it plays out according to kind of established social scripts. I'm reading off my phone, so wish me luck. Okay. Number 1, the end of oneself. To be touched, tongued by the octopus seems like it would be the end of oneself in a good way. So declares Sophie Lewis in her infamous review of the Oscar-winning documentary My Octopus Teacher. The film charts an affair between Craig Foster, a burnt-out filmmaker, and his octopus-turned-love interest. Longing to be inside nature, to shed the demands of modern life towards a greater authenticity, Foster embarks on a year of daily free dives in the kelp forest near the Cape of Storms at the tip of South Africa, where he spent much of his childhood. In My Octopus Teacher, the Atlantic is a wild and alien place. Plunging into the watery depths of the kelp forest, the film promises to sensitize its protagonist to the other, a role held by the octopus, but also arguably by her submarine environment. Foster professes, "I fell in love with her." His feelings for the octopus threaten to overwhelm him. He feels the boundary between them, quote, dissolve. He states, "There is no greater feeling on earth." This mind-blowing thrill is accompanied by a feeling of intense anxiety and vulnerability. In the end, the potential disturbance of Foster's encounter with the octopus is foreclosed, becoming instead, as Lewis suggests, an object lesson in scientific masculinity. If My Octopus Teacher knows it's a love story, it seems not to know that it's also a story about sex and race. The desire to dissolve that structures the film is marked from the start by a fantasy that ascribes this scene of oceanic undoing to the racialized and feminized other. The white scientist documentarian, unable to claim his own death-driven impulses towards disintegration, projects them into an oceanic setting, understood in psychoanalytic terms as a designated place suffused with fantasy. The ocean promises to unravel Foster's sovereignty, to wash away the colonial rift between man and his environment. During filmed interviews in his office, Foster recounts this imagined return to nature in misty-eyed, rapturous tones. His fantasy, a primordial merging, a sense of an indissoluble bond, a state of oneness, recalls the oceanic feeling introduced by Sigmund Freud in the opening to Civilization and Its Discontents in 1930. Freud promptly dismissed this idea as the idealized imaginings of the mystic. And yet, as the popularity of My Octopus Teacher makes clear, oceanic feeling persists in the mainstream cultural imaginary as a state that is both deeply desired and repudiated. What would it mean to take seriously Lewis's characteristically tongue-in-cheek claim that this oceanic encounter might spell the end of oneself in a good way? In this paper, I draw on the writings of French psychoanalyst and theorist Giulia Kristeva to pull on the threads of this oceanic feeling in its kind of idealized form and to grapple with the latent fantasies it contains. 2. Remember you are wild. My Octopus Teacher was produced by a group called the Sea Change Project. This initiative is devoted to, quote, connecting people to nature through science-based immersive storytelling. Emblazoned on the homepage of their website is the slogan, "Remember, you are wild." This phrase begs a number of questions. Who is the you and what is the wild summoned here? Why the injunction to remember one's wildness? The film's opening offers some clues. Foster recounts a period of depression. He says, "I'd been working hard for a long time and I had just worn myself out. I hadn't slept properly for months. My family was suffering. I just couldn't in that state be a good father to my son." Faced with these failures, Foster seeks a way out of his depression. He remembers. "Most of my childhood was spent in the rock pools, diving in the shallow kelp forest. That's what I most loved to do. And as an adult, I'd been separated from that. That was fine at first until I went to the Central Kalahari about 20 years ago. I met these men who were probably some of the best trackers in the world. They were inside of the natural world and I could feel that I was outside. I had this deep longing to be inside that world." The scene is set, a childhood spent in the ocean, in touch with nature, an adulthood marked by separation from this idyllic state. Having established proximity to nature as the long-forgotten province of childhood, Foster claims that his desire to be inside that world was reignited in him while filming a documentary about indigenous trackers in the Kalahari Desert in Botswana. No comment is made on the racial politics of this scene. Neither this earlier film's place in the colonial tradition of anthropological documentary making, nor Foster's own status as a white settler in South Africa. Yet the images are steeped in a racializing logic that consigns the Black body to nature. His deep longing to be inside the natural world is fantasized as a return to an earlier state of things, effecting a slippage between the lost innocence of childhood and the Black subjects of his earlier film. The associative connections made by Foster between nature, childhood, and Blackness locate these states as the authentic raw material, quote unquote, authentic raw material for the speaking subject, prior to or in excess of the symbolic order. As Dion Brand writes, quote, "To naturalize the Black body is by the same token to render it the silent object of scientific knowledge. The naturalized body has no ability to articulate itself outside of its given natural functions." She writes, "In Western culture, the natural is always captive to science." Foster's voiceover narration is accompanied by shots from his earlier film. Silent Black figures are shown in close-up, feet traversing sandy earth, eyes scanning the arid desert landscape. These images appear in contrast to the young Foster, who peers through the lens of a bulky camera. The juxtaposition of eyes to camera lens implies that to be inside nature is to have access to an unmediated proximity to one's environment. It's the ground zero of experience, captive to the scientist's, or indeed documentary maker's, representational frame. 3. I felt the boundary between us dissolve. My Octopus teacher is visually immersive, promising to dissolve the separation from nature Foster finds so troubling. It deploys the generic conventions of marine documentary, high-definition underwater footage of strange sea creatures, coral and sea anemones captured in radiant color, long tracking shots along the seabed or through sun-filtered kelp, ethereal music overlaid with bubbling water and whale sounds. In an early sequence, Foster is shown struggling to swim through rough waves. The muscular strokes of his front crawl are futile. The force of the water drags his body off course. As the water swells, he rises to the top of the frame before being tugged beneath the surface, disappearing from view. As Foster gives in to the water's pull, so too does the camera. The frame sways and lurches. The contingency of the camera's view seems to announce a relinquishing of control, as though surrendering to the ocean's swell. Like any good sex scene, the encounters between Foster and the octopus are full of skin-on-skin close-ups. Foster reports that he knew instinctively not to wear a wetsuit. If you want to get close to an environment like this, he says, it helps tremendously to have no barrier. The octopus's suckers stick to Foster's lips, his hands. They slide across the camera lens, enveloping the frame in sticky pink skin. These images position both ocean and octopus as desired objects that threaten to overwhelm the subject's discernible form. Then, having sensed the seduction of dissolution, the film backs off. Foster retreats to the firmer ground of symbolization. He arranges images of the octopus into taxonomic grids and maps, labels artifacts from the ocean floor, and sorts them into neat piles. During the COVID-19 lockdown, Sophie Lewis went viral for a series of tweets in which she claims that there's something conspicuously queer-phobic, repressed, about my octopus teacher's failure to dwell in the more threatening possibilities of Foster's octopus encounter. She writes, "Watching my octopus teacher as a trio of acid-tripping queers, it made us hoot with laughter when the straight driver first encounters what to us is so obviously a logic of femme excess." At one point, she tweets, "They have a form of sex." Lewis is persuasive. Quote, "To me, representations of octopuses straightforwardly say, behold this scary, sublime, flashing, cloud-colored concatenation of tongues. It threatens to give you the best orgasm of your life." Perhaps predictably, this thread produced an explosive backlash. Lewis was decried as, quote, "a plague to Western civilization," and instructed to seek professional help, sicko. Without giving too much credence to the Twitter sphere, the intensity of these tweets points to the very phobic reaction Lewis was drawing our attention to. If the octopus represents a kind of polymorphously perverse eroticism, which threatens to dissolve the boundaries of the subject's sovereignty, this is a possibility that the film, and clearly many of its viewers, cannot fully admit. Lewis's position, though, is also in danger of missing something. What does it mean to desire the end of oneself in a good way? Could such a desire ever be as straightforward as Lewis implies? Her formulation turns the subject's pull towards its own dissolution paradoxically into a set of knowable objects and relations, undercutting the messy ambivalence she claims to avow. What would it mean to think of the desire for dissolution instead as that which can never be fully claimed or known by the subject? Turning to Kristeva's writing on the Oceanic points in some useful directions. 4. The strange thing, narcissism and the lost object. For Kristeva, the pull towards dissolution involves an ambivalent negotiation of desire, identification, and disavowal. In her 1987 book, Black Sun, Depression and Melancholia, Kristeva imagines the Oceanic as a pull to reunite with archaic non-integration. She calls on the sea as an originary space. It is, quote, "the osmosis of the subject in the common flesh of a not yet oneself, swallowed up in a not yet world." This is an ocean of semiotics, the not yet differentiated borders between infant and maternal body. In My Octopus Teacher, the Oceanic setting acts as a placeholder for this fantasized prior state of things, when the contours of Foster's subjectivity were dissolved into common flesh. Examining the Oceanic in Kristeva's writing makes the psychic stakes of Foster's encounter clear. For the individuated subject, a fantasized return to dissolution is a form of symbolic suicide. In other words, the end of oneself is not a place the subject can viably live. In the film, the octopus appears as a liquid animal, shape-shifting, billowing clouds of ink and jetting forward, tentacles splayed. Its slimy, amorphous body represents a kind of exteriorized interiority, human insides spilled outwards. Foster states, "A lot of people say that an octopus is like an alien, but the strange thing is, as you get closer to them, you realize that you're very similar in lots of ways." The closer Foster gets, the less clear the octopus's symbolic difference, its absolute otherness, becomes. exposing instead a disturbing likeness which opens up the possibility for identification. This, he says, is the strange thing. A fundamental narcissism is at play here, not only in the film's determination to transmute the encounter into an opportunity for quasi-therapeutic self-improvement, the octopus playing the role of Foster's teacher, but also in its fantasy of boundaryless union. The desire for dissolution is marked by a fantasized return to a prior state of things, in which the other is not yet perceived as other, but instead as the self's borderline element. In this instance, the love for the desired object is a barely disguised narcissistic self-love. The subject fantasizes a return to a pre-Oedipal state of blissful fusion with the maternal object, whom he imagines he will never have to give up. So the film's disavowal of its own erotic investments that Lewis finds so disappointing come into view here as kind of inherent to this narcissistic melancholia that Kristeva describes. This position is feminized for Kristeva insofar as it signals an ongoing identification with the maternal object and a failure to enter into the world of language, structure, and form. She writes, "At the dawn of individuation, a life raft appears on the horizon of the oceanic feeling, the loving father," which in Kristeva's writing really means like entry into the symbolic. In other words, only admission into the symbolic economy can rescue the subject from the maternal oceanic void. And so, my octopus teacher promises oceanic dissolution, only to return to reassuringly dry land, apparently having learned its lesson. This return is precipitated significantly by the octopus's death. Having mated and incubated her eggs, the octopus slowly sacrifices herself, quote, timing her death exactly for the hatching of those eggs. Then she is ripped limb from limb, torn apart by ocean creatures. Foster looks on as her body literally disintegrates into the ocean. In the film's closing scenes, Foster returns to the kelp forest with his teenage son in tow. They find a baby octopus and imagine that it might be one of her young. If Foster's attachment to the oceanic feeling promised by his union with the octopus was marked by a regression to a kind of pre-Oedipal bliss, he finds his way out by taking up the triangulating function of the Oedipal father, the bearer of symbolic law. And I think this is kind of captured in the film by his obsession with putting everything into these kind of taxonomic grids, sorting through his more kind of formless sense of experience with the octopus. For the subject of psychoanalysis, the urge both to separate from and reunite with the lost object, in Kristeva's terms, the pre-Oedipal mother, is inherent to psychic development. What becomes clear in my octopus teacher is that these internal dramas play out according to established social scripts. It's not a coincidence that the film projects the scene of dissolution into a feminized and racialized setting, or that it retreats from the risks of this scene through its appeals to the generic conventions of eco-documentary, scientific discovery, and reproductive futurity. Foster is eventually restored to the status of responsible conservationist and, quote, good father, taking up his rightful place in the nuclear family. These symbolic registers reinstate a safe distance and proper relational structure, rescuing Foster from the disturbances of his own desire. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Tasha, and everyone who joined me in thanking Tasha for a brilliant presentation.